All around the world, there are strange reports of man-like canine beasts. They go by many names: shapeshifters, beasts, dogmen, and manwolf. Throughout time, the image of the canine-human hybrid has continued to weave its way from people to people, from culture to culture, from religion to religion, with the cryptozoological suspicion that some people truly believe that they have witnessed such a hybrid. Some have asked whether the truth behind these sightings is somehow linked to the deep-rooted cultural history of werewolves.
As the subject of man-wolf sightings and the research surrounding it has gotten more popular, so has the idea that there is a sort of cultural link between ancient stories and modern stories. Essentially, the idea that some people are beginning to put forward is that perhaps these ancient stories that we have around the world of these canine humanoids is something that is actually directly related to what, perhaps in their perception of the world, is the existence of man-wolves. An example might be when you go into deep folklore of Europe and you find stories of werewolves. Perhaps those stories of werewolves are based on actual reports and actual encounters with real-life werewolves, aka the man-wolf, whatever the man-wolf is.
Some of the oldest references we know of that concern spiritual or supernatural canines, or perhaps upright walking wolves, come from Mesopotamian folklore. This is where we see mentions of Urudimu, the gruesome hound, and also the demon Pazuzu, which is much more well known in the modern day due to the Exorcist movies. But some of the earliest depictions of Pazuzu concern an upright walking canine figure, often depicted with a scorpion's tail or with wings, but the canine visage is still present. Some scholars have speculated that these entities were references to lions or other large cats and not canines, but recent scholars and work that's been done by them suggests that these were most likely depictions of canines that existed in Mesopotamia at this point in history.
Different cultures have viewed wolves differently and held them in different statuses in their own culture. But I think most of the time you come across a kind of monstrous depiction of wolves because, like bears, like tigers, like hyenas, wolves are apex predators and they're extremely dangerous. They present a lot of danger to people in the past, and I think that reflects in places like Japan. Some traditions involved, gifting to the den of wolves. They would leave gifts right at the den just to kind of ask for protection over their flocks so that the wolves wouldn't hunt their flocks. And that's kind of like an age-old tradition, right? Is you have farmers and flocks of animals, and then you have the wolves that prey on those flocks. And I think that's where the greatest amount of cultural tradition kind of stems from in terms of wolves. But then again, you also have the country of Chechnya, which the folklore states that the Chechens are descendants of a she-wolf, and so therefore the wolf is the kind of national symbol of Chechnya, which of course calls into mind the tradition of Romulus and Remus, founders of ancient Rome. They were twins that were ordered to death by their uncle Emilius, and the executioner couldn't bring himself to do that, so he left the children on the banks of the river Tiber, and the river rose and carried the cradle away to a mother wolf named Lupa. And so what you have is the she-wolf rose the two children, and they ended up becoming the founders of Rome. And so they were viewed in Rome as kind of a symbol of strength, not necessarily fertility, as you might think from that story, but as far as I can tell, the ancient Romans didn't actually hunt wolves unless it was specifically in regards to them attacking a herd or a flock of animals. So you have that kind of tradition as well. So yeah, wolves have been viewed differently in different cultures. But I would say that the commonality between all the different traditions is a healthy respect for the animal, because at the end of the day, wolves are predators, and people did know that, especially in the ancient world, and therefore respected it. And the different levels of respect, there's respect out of fear, but there's also a healthy respect as this animal is hunting, it's doing its nature, it's fulfilling its purpose, and we need to respect that.
patterns in these depictions and in these entities can be difficult to identify, as the way that they are described and depicted depends upon the civilization and the point in history that we're studying. But the upright canine visage is present almost every single time if we're talking about ancient werewolves or ancient shapeshifters. And there are creatures that come from other parts of the globe, Mesopotamia being just one example. We have shapeshifters in South America, we have them in Asia, we have them on the North American continent. So the idea that there may be a connection to some of these much, much older stories and modern day sightings of dogmen, what some people will describe as werewolves, skinwalkers, the Rougarou, the idea that there's some connection between them, in my opinion, is not too far-fetched, because we do see these descriptions coming up again and again and again all throughout history, and very often they're described, almost in every case, as being fearsome, dangerous, demonic, otherworldly. When they're described more as animals, they are not described as being friendly or a natural part of nature. That is something that is consistent almost every time we're talking about a dogman or werewolf-like entity, with some minor exceptions. The Wolver of Scotland being one, which is described more as a benevolent creature that is very good at fishing, will guide lost travelers home, and even leave fish on the windowsills of people who are starving. This is a sharp contrast to what we see pretty much across the board in terms of modern dogman encounters, historical depictions of supernatural canines, and cryptid encounters in general.
The thing is that those ancient stories are really, really varied. And the subjects, what they seem to mean, their locale, and the way that their stories play out actually varies wildly between stories. One of the most popular examples that you even get to study in some courses in college is that of the cynocephali. This comes from a Greek word which essentially means dog-headed person. And cynocephali are this grouping of images that was found throughout many cultures in Europe that often depicts at least, people from kind of obscure or faraway places as dog-headed people, or in other cases similar to cynocephali, as one-eyed people, people who have no heads and have faces on their chests, etc., etc. Something that really drives home the strangeness of the foreign. And cynocephali are found a lot in referenced European history. For example, perhaps the strongest example, is that of Saint Christopher, which in non-Orthodox views of the Christian literature was a saint who was a cynocephali, who had the head of a dog. And this was actually used to represent the sort of, perhaps in that particular religious view, the sinful lifestyle that St. Christopher lived out, being kind of a rascal and a nomad and sort of having a bad reputation and worshipping the devil even at one point, but then coming into a sort of, for lack of a better term, a come to Jesus moment, right, where he, in the story of this spiritual journey of his, devotes himself to the Christian God, and in doing so becomes a saint. And he is still depicted afterwards in some of the Russian depictions with the head of a dog, and it's this sort of idea of redemption that revolves around Saint Christopher. There are other examples too. There are examples that people speculate are actually depictions of unknown primates, at the time at least, such as lemurs from Madagascar, that kind of resemble what we would call a cynocephali, this kind of dog-headed person. And when you think about it, that is kind of what you would try to call something like a lemur if you had no idea what a primate was, which obviously the layperson in, let's say, ancient Rome might not know what a baboon or a lemur looks like. There is also indication that cynocephalus was a word that the Greeks used to refer to things like baboons. So there is a strong connection there as well between real-world encounters and cynocephali. The thing about these old stories is that sometimes they're used to refer to these real things, right? Like the baboon or the lemur. But a lot of the times, such as in the example of St. Christopher, they have some kind of point to the story that the dog-headedness of the subject that we might, in today's circles, call something like a man-wolf, serves.
It's difficult to try to say that there's a specific werewolf archetype, because there are a lot of humanoid, wolf-like creatures that appear in mythology, but I don't think necessarily they are werewolves or as anything that we would classify as a werewolf. Take for example the Egyptian god Anubis. That's not a werewolf, it's not a dogman, it's a mythological, symbolic representation of something that factored into the belief system of the ancient Egyptians. If we're trying to separate where the werewolf archetype is and the just dog-headed, man-like creatures that exist in mythology, I think you're going to end up culling a lot of things out of the supposed werewolf historical or even archetypal legend. For example, the mythological king of Arcadia, Lycan, who served up his son to test Zeus's omnipotence and subsequently was turned into a wolf, you could say resembles a werewolf story, but isn't a werewolf story, right? Because that's not exactly what's happening when it comes to a werewolf, which is a shape-shifting entity that can switch between a wolf and a man. You have stories like that, you have stories like Lycan that are more related to social commentary. The people of Arcadia were cannibals, and that didn't sit right with the rest of ancient Greece, and so they kind of compared them to wolves in that sense. They're no better than the beasts around us. Mythological stories like that, where they're just kind of symbolic representations of social commentary, but the concept of werewolves seems to be relegated mostly to taboo kind of subjects, if we're talking about a true werewolf and not just dog-headed, man-like creatures.
There are some descriptions of these sort of werewolf-like entities throughout cultures that might be a little bit harder to describe because of that missing information, and maybe that's why they end up in these man-wolf conversations. So, for example, you have the Russian Soglov, which is this depiction of a sort of one-eyed man-wolf hybrid that is sometimes depicted as a very sort of battle-worn or war-torn creature, and it has these iron fangs and this bloodlust, and so that might be a cautionary tale. On the other end of things, you have in the Baltic region in Livonia in 1692 a description of a belief of the legend of what were called the Hounds of God, which similar to a sort of flipped end Soglov, where you have these very battle-ready werewolf-like people or creatures who supposedly 3 nights a year, instead of being something dangerous, would go off and do these heroic deeds and would travel underground to fight the forces of the devil. And that sort of ancient belief system really put these different depictions of werewolves into wildly different categories that were so different that it's really hard to actually say that there is a single wolf or werewolf archetype at all, as in a sort of underlying widespread metaphor that is self-similar being put together here, because the stories are just so different. And different from those werewolf stories, you have stories of shapeshifters. So even though we have things like the loup-garou in the French-Canadian folklore, which there are stories of medicine women who could turn into the loup-garou because of the betrayal that their husbands, who were often white settlers, had done to them, or the stories of loup-garou tribes who would gather around these ghostly fires and could disappear. These are old stories that all have the only connective tissue sometimes being the visual description of a shapeshifter or someone who's in between the animal and the human all the time. But they all seem to mean different things. And what that might indicate is that the view that modern man-wolf sightings are attributable to the same phenomenon as these stories paints a really inconsistent picture of phenomenon in general. It seems really hard to wrap your head around the idea that all of these stories came from encounters with things and not just from similar ideas being expressed.
You could even refer to the concept of donning the skin of an animal, which a lot of the Viking berserkers would don the skin of a wolf in order to summon the powers or to gain the abilities of that predator. So stealthy walking, one of those powers that they hope to obtain by wearing the skin of a wolf. But again, I don't think there was any idea about them turning into a wolf. So the archetype of a werewolf, of someone specifically turning into a wolf for reasons that are not specific to social commentary or the creation story of a wolf, I think are very, very rare. And they seem to be shamanistic and taboo in their culture. That's not to say, though, that people did not believe in werewolves throughout history, because we have the medieval Inquisition, which is, late 1500s, early 1600s, where over 30,000 people were executed for being werewolves. The belief, at least in medieval Europe, was that people became werewolves through a pact with the devil. And as far as my own research goes, that's what I seem to have come across, For example, in Morocco, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and other countries in Africa, you have something that's called the Buddha. The name varies in different regions, but essentially what you have is a were-hyena, which is shamans practicing a certain ritual that will allow them to transform into the form of a hyena, which also sounds a lot like the Navajo skinwalker, right? Which you wouldn't necessarily classify a skinwalker as a werewolf, but the concept of a shaman or a person practicing some sort of ritual that will allow them to transform into an animal, to gain the animal's abilities and physically transform at the same time, seems to be very, very few in number and spread across the globe. And again, it's always very taboo, it's very, very niche. We're talking about special practitioners performing certain rituals to become a werewolf, to become a were-hyena. So the percentage of people that are doing this is infinitesimal. And so if we're going to talk about werewolves or archetype of a werewolf, I'm not sure if we can say there's an archetype of werewolves as much as there's an archetype of shapeshifters in culture, which I think it would be better suited in. It's a difficult question to answer because we're talking about multiple different things that all get lumped into the same thing. There's mythology of dog-headed man-like creatures, which seem to be different from the actual belief of people shape-shifting into different creatures, which is something that we would probably call a werewolf, right? That's what our modern-day depiction of a werewolf is someone transforming into a wolf rather than a person being transformed into a wolf by the ancient god Zeus or Thor or something like that.